Soul Stalker, Chapter 2, The Underground, written by Paige Turner. Hey again, Taylor here, the girl who sold her soul to work at a haunted maze. Well, I couldn't have phrased that worse, but I bet you remember me now. Or in case you've stumbled upon this without listening to my first upload, I've left a link in the description box. Seriously, it's almost an hour long, so I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with this insanity before diving into part 2. That being said, I'm going to give a brief recap since I know many of you will try to power through it anyway, mainly because that's what I would do, even though it's completely illogical. It's fine. Welcome. You're among friends. Okay, so here's the basics. I worked at a haunted maze throughout October, but the manager, Pete, ended up being a prick who sold all of our souls to his demon boss lady. And I do mean all, as in every employee and the vast majority of customers. We were then turned into our costumes and forced to hunt the customers like prey. Once a customer died, their bodies were inhabited by a soul from limbo, so no one had a clue that anything sinister was taking place. Except for me. I have a special gift that allowed me to retain memories of the event. My cousin, Lori, she wore my costume and covered my shift while I entered the maze as a customer. But it turns out that clause in the employee contract was specific to the employee, the one that allowed us to assume the identity of our costumes. This left Lori vulnerable, and due to this, she was captured and killed. My life was ultimately spared because murdering me was an unnecessary risk since no one would believe my story anyway. Well, those are the broad strokes, but again, that was nearly an hour's worth of information condensed into less than 200 words, and a lot has happened since, to the point that I can't put off this update any longer. I'd hoped to wait until I could end it with, so that's how I got my soul back, and that's why I have to quit, but I'm nowhere close to either of those conclusions. At this rate, I'll have to write a book before it's over, so it's probably better to just catch up now. Besides, I'm still Mr. Magooing my way through this. I'd rather not leave some huge mystery behind if I turn up dead. It would really suck to put my family through the extra grief. I was expecting to have an entire year to prepare for my next encounter with Pete and Mags. In my first upload, I thought the only way to get my soul back was for Mags to somehow break the agreement, which seemed impossible since the terms have already been fulfilled. But I've since done a bit more research, and killing her might also do the trick. The problem is figuring out how to do that. Seriously, you Google that shit and see how many answers you get. Even if you separate out all of the obvious trolls and fiction, you know what's left. The ones who genuinely think they're right, but they're actually just crazy or flat wrong. The ones who want you to pay them to do it for you, which, if I thought any of them were real, you better believe that's the route I would take. Trolls who put in effort to sound plausible, because we're talking about demons. At what point do we cross back into bullshit territory? And finally, a stone-cold certainty that none of the answers are real, and choosing the wrong one is going to get you killed. In truth, I didn't even think a year would be long enough, and then I stumbled upon an ad for a Christmas-themed maze. The greedy bastards couldn't be happy with the thousands of souls they'd already stolen. Oh no, they wanted to stay open year-round. The virtual tour showed a setup very similar to our Halloween maze, except, well, jolly. Instead of a cornfield, it was made out of tall hedges, decorated with colorful lights, wreaths, and garlands. The roamers were no longer characters like Michael, Jason, and Freddy. They were elves, toy soldiers, gingerbread men, and more. But there was only one Santa. At the maze's center was a giant open square with an elaborate North Pole setup. One side was decorated like Santa's workshop, and several elves sat at a long table where they assembled new toys on the other side. Mrs. Claus sat at home, knitting by a cozy fire while more elves decorated a tree. The main attraction, however, was the sleigh, which sat atop a big snowy mound between these two scenes. 9 actual reindeer, led by Rudolph, of course, stood before it and ate from the hands of adoring patrons while children had their picture taken with Santa. Unfortunately, they'd moved all the way to White Falls, Maine, so there was no way that I could get there before the 27th, but I booked a flight anyway. After Halloween, they took off and left the maze behind like it was abandoned by Disney, and I figured they would do the same thing here. It's not like I expected to find anything. I mostly just wanted to see the place before interviewing any customers or employees that I was able to track down. In the meantime, I poured through everything I could find online, and the results were nothing like what we had with the original maze. There was no blind adoration or all 5-star reviews. Plenty of people enjoyed the atmosphere and photo ops, but most of the feedback came from outraged Christians and parents. The main problem was the drastic change in their target audience. That which appeals to horror junkies doesn't often appeal to families celebrating Christmas, especially the religious ones. You might remember those t-shirts people got when they signed away their souls with the fake disclaimers. The ones that said, "I sold my soul at the maze, but all I got was this lousy shirt." Well, they added a bed of snow beneath the words and put a Santa hat on the first eye. Not the most creative choice, but at least they did something. I half expected them to leave the spiderwebs in Gothic font. Not that it mattered. Most people, especially parents, they found the t-shirts cute for Halloween because they were appropriately themed for the occasion, but these were just offensive. It didn't feel so much like a joke anymore. The Wednesday after Christmas, which was the 27th, I arrived in White Falls but waited for the following night to visit the maze. To get there, I had to drive to a secluded area that no one would ever stumble upon by mistake. Looking at a map, it's not that far from town. But the trip took close to an hour by car, and it's not a route that I would want to travel every day either. Most of the winding back roads were only wide enough for a single car. If they got through the whole season without a single accident, it should officially qualify as a Christmas miracle. I probably could have visited the maze during the day, but it felt safer to go at night, just in case there was any lingering staff. The entrance was marked by 2 giant candy canes with a wide banner stretched between them. Only the top corner was now hanging loose. For how obsessed Pete was with his designs, you'd think he'd want to use some kind of clever name, but he felt that his work didn't need it. That it wasn't just a maze, it was the maze. No further distinction necessary. Motion-activated floodlights were spread out far enough that you'd never have to walk more than a few steps in darkness before the next one activated. They must have been solar-powered because nothing else seemed to have electricity. But I'm just grateful I didn't have to rely on my flashlight the whole time. Just inside the entrance was an information kiosk with a box of maps still stashed beneath the counter. As I proceeded to the next area, it was quickly apparent that Pete had stuck with the same layout. There were themed sections between the open areas where the roamers patrolled, and first up was the Grinch. A Mount Crumpet replica stood as tall as the hedge wall, with a slide built into the summit. I had seen enough pictures to know that kids would climb to the top, take a picture with the Grinch, and slide down to meet Max and Cindy Lou Who. Another section featured Ebenezer Scrooge, the spirits who visited him, and the whole Cratchit family. From there, Candy Cane Lane led me to a gingerbread house, followed by the Polar Express, where the conductor waved at me from an open window. The next big scene was an elaborate display for the Nutcracker. Someone had left behind the head of the Mouse King costume, but it looked like a repurposed Chuck E. Cheese head. I went through the field of snow that transitioned into the North Pole area, which was where Frosty lived, with all of his snowmen and women friends. Beyond that, Santa's sleigh stood seemingly empty, except for a red clown nose lying on the front seat, cut open, presumably to fit over one of the reindeer's noses. I threw it into the back, only to hear a loud grunt, followed by a glass bottle hitting the floor and an angry curse. Then Pete shot up in the back seat, yelling that this was why he hated kids. Barely containing my own scream, I turned on my taser and stood ready to use it. But at the sound of its electric pops, he squinted and raised his hands defensively. He didn't care what I stole and even recommended the items that would sell for a decent price. The drunk bastard was looking right at my face, but he didn't recognize me. I'd been around Tipsy Pete enough to know that Drunk Pete would probably tell me anything if I could get him talking. That's how I know way too much about his ex-wife and failed businesses. Once he got started, there was no off switch. My heart was hammering in my chest. But when would I have this chance again? Besides, even if he did recognize me, I knew that I could easily outrun him in that condition. I started with, "Hey, aren't you the guy that owns this place?" And that was all the prompting he needed for the whole story to pour out of him. The maze had been done even worse than I realized, and Mags wasn't happy with her golden boy anymore. Of course, he said things like the boss or promo shirts, but I knew what he actually meant. If not for the employees, he would have only gotten 3 souls, and those were from a group of stoners who thought they were buying a band t-shirt. Mags isn't one to take these kinds of lapses lightly either. Now that he had failed to meet his quota, she was taking over for the New Year's maze. If you're like me, you're probably wondering what the hell would that even involve. And, well, in short, they just ripped off the Chinese New Year. Even though theirs takes place like a month after ours, Pete explained that they planned to make a Valentine's Day maze for February, so they would just transition right into that. And then a St. Patrick's Day maze for March. He was actually complaining about Easter being on March 31st, because it put the 2 holidays too close together, ruined their chance to do an April Fool's one. I couldn't help but ask what he intended to do without it being insanely cheesy. And he broke down into tears, a full, drunken, sobbing mess. His enthusiasm was all an overly sarcastic act. He dreamed of creating a haunted maze so popular that it could stay open all year long, and he thought that he was pretty close to succeeding. But now Mags had taken it all away. She didn't want to close when Halloween ended, but just as Pete had warned, no one returned the next day. He tried to explain a 3-year plan would allow them to remain open past the spooky season, but that was far too long for a demon with no patience. She had lost souls lined up for new bodies, after all. Everywhere she looked, humans were already beginning to celebrate Christmas. So she decided that they would just simply change the theme and reopen the following month instead. But even though it was her idea, it was Pete's neck on the line. He did his best to do what he could, but certain parts, like the contracts, they just weren't compatible. All this time, he continued drinking from his bottle and, little by little, forgot to speak in code. Someone else would have asked, "What contracts?" But I pretended not to notice, stuck to basic questions like, "But what's your boss lady gonna do when she's in charge of the New Year's maze and it fails even worse?" I had a feeling the answer to that question was the real reason that he was out there drinking himself to death. But again, my instincts were wrong. Seriously, how am I still alive? Oh, right. I'm the girl who turned Mr. Magoo into a verb. Sweet. Moving on. He was actually out there because the New Year maze had its grand opening that day, and he was terrified of returning. Apparently, it was in a very dangerous location and not open to the general public. That made no sense, seemed counterproductive to their purpose. But then he explained that each employee and approved customer were required to sign confidentiality agreements. Again, I understood he was referencing the soul contracts. I just couldn't fathom how calling it something else was possibly making a difference, or how to further clarify without giving myself away. So, I focused on the location instead, but still didn't have a ton of luck there either. He was slurring worse with every pull from the bottle, and only a few sips away from being completely unintelligible. So I had to be quick. Pete compared the new location to an underground fight club, password only, and spoke of how the profits made from gambling more than made up for what was lost in the customer volume. You see, the underground aspects attract a very specific type of clientele. People, especially the rich and powerful, are suckers for exclusivity, but it also draws in the desperate, the ones so addicted to gambling that they're only a day away from some bookie ending their lives. There's no risk they won't take, and those are the ones Mags wants the most. They serve as her volunteers. Suddenly, this puts the selling one's soul back in the appropriately themed category. They think, oh, this place is so secretive, so edgy, that our very souls are the payment. Yes, please. My brain was desperately trying to fit these new pieces into the puzzle, while still following his drunken words, which were basically a whole new language by now. But it wasn't until I asked what people were supposed to bet on that the awful picture began to take shape. The customers wouldn't be in the maze. They would be spectators, watching the revival of Rome's Colosseum with modern holiday themes. That meant those desperate volunteers were likely being forced to battle against the Chinese zodiacs. I probably could have asked one more question before Pete was gone with his own noxious wind, but a sudden chill shot through my entire body. The hair on my arms and neck stood up straight, and I was consumed with a sickening dread that something awful would happen if I didn't leave immediately. I've been learning to trust those feelings since discovering more about my, special ability, and I didn't hesitate to book it. I ran out of the pole and into the display for the Nightmare Before Christmas. When Mag's furious screams reached my ears, from what little I overheard before leaving earshot, it was clear that Pete had made a habit of drinking himself belligerent, but I couldn't stick around for the full show. The next display was the house from A Christmas Story. The leg lamp glowed prominently in the front window, and across the miniature street was the Griswold family home, complete with the brothers' camper by the curb. I moved quickly but quietly and heard no sounds of pursuit as I entered the final section. It was a smaller area with only a gift shop and concession stand on either side of the exit. Instead of a Grim Reaper, the exit was now a giant nutcracker's head with the door inside of its mouth. The walkway sloped backwards and bounced just enough to make you feel like it might suddenly snap shut on you at any second. My car sat roughly 50 feet away, and the floodlights were much dimmer than the others had been. Not eager to walk through the pitch-black, starless night, I paused to turn on my flashlight. The moment my finger hovered over the button, that weird spidey sense hit me again. It's like having COVID while deciding to pull the plug on a dying family member. Just a literal sickening dread. I froze, not wanting to spotlight myself, but too frightened to run blindly through the night. Then, the light above my head began to flicker with the sharp buzz of an electrical short before exploding, and fine shards of glass rained down atop my head as the darkness fully engulfed me. I ran for the bulky shape in the distance that I knew to be my car, even though the ground was nothing but a blank void beneath me. But a little over halfway there, my left foot dropped into a pothole and sent me spiraling into the hard pavement. I couldn't help a pained grunt as my ankle twisted, and the loose gravel cut open my knees and palms. But it only hurt for that brief instant before falling numb beneath fresh waves of adrenaline. I listened for any hint of movement, but there was only the slight whistle of the freezing wind that blew into my face. With an increasing sense of urgency, I tried pushing myself off the ground, only to place my hand into something that, at first, felt like a cluster of rocks half protruding from the cracked pavement. But then it rose into the air and came back down with incredible speed and force. Had I not instinctively jerked my hand back the instant it moved, Mags would have crushed it beneath her heavy boot. This was all still just a series of dark shadows, but it was impossible to mistake the sound of her heel against the concrete or her sinister laugh as she reveled in my terror. I tried to push myself backwards, but my injured ankle was still caught in the hole, and a fresh burst of pain shot up my leg. The last thing I remember is the sensation of falling as the pothole trapping my ankle suddenly morphed into a bottomless pit and swallowed me whole. When I woke, everything was still, and my body ached all over. I was sitting on a cold stone floor, with my back leaned against a creaky wood paneling, and I had no idea how much time had passed or if I was still at the maze. It was only a matter of seconds after regaining consciousness that my small cage filled with light. Though I didn't know it yet, I was locked in a rectangular stone building, like a dugout, with 3 small rooms created by wooden wall dividers installed every 4 feet. I initially believed them to be little prison cells, but they were actually just dressing rooms. Before I could consider much else about my surroundings, a middle-aged, portly, blonde woman with blue streaks in her hair appeared in the small square opening of my stall, and both of our eyes widened with recognition. Amelia was the last new makeup artist to start work at the Halloween maze before I quit. It seems she's still waiting for a new body, but I guess that's not a surprise with how poorly the Christmas season went. By now, more than anything, I wanted to know how much time had passed. To my surprise, it was almost a full 24 hours later, and I'd been transported to the New Year's maze in order to be the first gladiator of the night. On one hand, it solved my problem of how to find it. On the other, well, it's not exactly how I pictured things going. It would be really hard to kill Mags if I lost my body to someone like Amelia. I didn't struggle as she administered first aid to my injuries, or when she brought me out of the stall to do my makeup, and I changed into my costume without a fuss. There was a door at each end of the long room, but my ankle wouldn't even support my weight. I didn't know how I was going to walk, let alone run. Nor did I have the mental faculties to tackle more than a single problem at once, so I gathered information and took in my surroundings. Outside of my cell, the rest of the building was like the backstage of a movie set. There were racks of costumes, a couple of salon chairs, and a vanity with makeup cases and hair products lining its surface. Amelia wouldn't tell me everything I wanted to know, but I learned the basics of how things were supposed to work. The employees were dressed as Chinese zodiac animals and placed in appropriately themed territories with unique weapons. For instance, the pig was played by an actual former sumo wrestler who used his body as a weapon, and his territory was a literal mud pit with a thin, grassy border. He was also the one who guarded the exit and the only unavoidable encounter. You know, if we pretend I was capable of reaching the end. But the specifics didn't really matter if I couldn't even stand. Make no mistake, it was underground for a reason. The weapons were blunted. They weren't meant to kill you, but they were gonna fuck you up. Aside from the desperate, every asshole who considered themselves to be some special tough guy thought it was an easy way to make $5,000, which was barely table scraps compared to what the high rollers were gambling. It wasn't a matter of whether someone would win or lose, so much as how long they would last and what rooms they would face. Amelia was telling me about the former Cirque du Soleil performer. They were one who played the monkey when Mags entered through the door closest to the changing stalls. Fortunately, she agreed that it wouldn't make for a very good show if I died in the first minute. She wanted the audience to see that even a small girl could win a few rounds so that it would encourage more volunteers. She said a little magic healing powder is all it would take to fix me up good as new. If it wasn't for the fact that she was only helping me in order to make my death more entertaining, I wouldn't trust anything she gave me. Of course, it's not like I had many options in the matter. I watched carefully as she removed a small vial and a silver tray from a handbag. It looked suspiciously like stitched-together patches of skin. The vial contained white powder, which she then poured onto the tray. I assumed it needed to be mixed with water or something, but instead, she held the pile up close to my face, inhaled deeply, and blew. I gasped, fully expecting the powder to explode into a fine mist, but it didn't. It stretched upward into a long, thin line, like a standing snake. Then it struck, fast as a whip, shooting straight up into my nose, which I sucked back in an involuntary breath. My sinus cavities were filled with a, totally unfamiliar, foreign, numbing sensation that I've absolutely never felt in my life. As I choked and gasped, Mags casually mentioned that the main ingredient, coca plant leaves, could have that effect, but it was normal and not a cause for concern. Not that I knew this at the time or anything, but coca plant is what produces cocaine. So, yeah, the miracle healing powder was 80% pure blow. Don't get me wrong, the effects were instantaneous, and I felt like $1,000,000. But I would have preferred to keep a clear head. Well, an actual clear head, not just one that tried to convince me I was Wonder Woman. While the first waves of euphoria washed over me, Mags explained that I had two choices. I could go out there, refuse to play, and tell everyone that I was there against my will, but it wouldn't stop the game on the other side. The only exits were locked from an office control panel, so I still wouldn't be able to leave. Or, conversely, I could really play and try to win my freedom. The scariest part is how much it felt like I actually could win. Whatever was in the other 20% of that white powder must have been magical after all, because my ankle was back to its normal size, and my other injuries had likewise healed. With a few final touches to my costume, I was led out of the opposite door from where Mags entered and into a long, caged walkway, one that ended with two doors, set into a 15-foot hedge wall. I couldn't begin to judge the maze's full size, but we were definitely inside a roofless stadium, big enough to house a football field. The ground was dug out so that we sat in kind of a bowl, and the seats were raised to give the spectators a bird's-eye view over the action. Hundreds of incredibly bright lights eliminated any trace of the abysmal darkness surrounding the stadium, and every inch of the field was captured by huge monitors to ensure the nosebleed section got their money's worth. The crowd was too far away for me to make out the faces of anyone beyond the closest row, but the ones I did see all reminded me of Batman villains, like they came straight from Arkham Asylum. I had been so busy studying my surroundings that I hadn't noticed Mag's transformation. She was now a beautiful young woman with jet black hair, deep brown eyes, porcelain skin. She waved at the audience, revealing a set of perfect, gleaming white teeth as she explained the rules to the cheering crowd as if we were on a game show. My heart was hammering faster than ever, thanks to the combination of unsolicited cocaine and sheer terror, but I was laser-focused on the closest monitor as she spoke. Most of what she said was information I'd already learned from Amelia, but as she listed the animals, their images flashed across the screens with short bios. There were 12 in total. The rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig. They were all frightening in their own way, but some would be an instant defeat if chosen. The Russian man playing the dragon, for instance, was 6'4" ex-Special Forces, and his weapon was a friggin' flamethrower. The ox looked like the Mountain from Game of Thrones. There's no other way to describe him. Actually, I'm not entirely sure it wasn't that guy. He had a horned helmet strapped to his head that looked like a weapon unto itself, but he also wielded a giant wooden club equal to the length of his arm. The tiger was a woman who looked like she came out of a Mortal Kombat game, and she wore gloves with long, sharp claws, but remember, that's only the real world. The other side was so much worse. I was given a traditional Roman sword and shield, but they felt useless in my untrained hands. Like the former mazes, I wouldn't be required to go through each section. But once a door was chosen, I couldn't leave until pressing a buzzer that rested on a square pillar in the center of each room. Which opponents I faced and how many were based on pure luck. At best, the game could be won with as few as 5 encounters. At worst, it was possible to face every opponent. When the instructions were finally over, it was time to choose one of the 2 doors before me. The only question now was, right or left? For no particular reason, I went left, and the moment I walked through the door, a small woman dressed as the rat rushed towards me with a long wooden staff. She had a pointed nose strapped around her face, a long tail attached to her backside, and big, floppy rat foot slippers on her feet. I barely had time to register that the room was decorated like a rundown industrial kitchen before being forced to dive out of the way. I'm not endorsing drug usage by saying the cocaine saved my life. I could, but I'm not. The woman was at least a full 2 feet shorter than myself, but she was faster and used her tail as a whip. When I dove out of the way for a second time, she turned, and the weighted tail made contact with my side, knocking me onto the tiled floor. Though I only felt numbness at the time, I would later find a long, dark bruise across my ribs and part of my back. It hurts every time I inhale. The only consolation is that it pushed me closer to the buzzer. The center pillar stood between 4 to 5 feet tall, and like the walls, each side was identical. I threw myself at the red buzzer on top, and a cheerful tune played while the dim room brightened significantly. I turned to see the rat woman was now standing at attention, her weapon at her side. Every wall was identical from every angle down, except for the doors. One wall had only 1 door, while the opposite wall had 2. I felt rushed to make a decision because I didn't know how my soul was faring on the other side. Was the rat stopped over there too? Was it an actual rat? Or some kind of mutated monster? As these questions swirled around in my brain, the world shifted, and I was suddenly inside a real kitchen. I had willed the switch to happen. It seems that exercising my ability paid off. I turned a quick circle as my eyes sought the rat, and for half a second, I felt a wave of relief to see that it was only a rodent no bigger than my boot, but its red, beady eyes tracked my every move, while a thick, white foam dripped from its mouth. The animals were sentient and rabid. Suddenly, the costumed badasses didn't seem so impossible. No matter how fast humans are, animals are much faster and stronger. Our only advantage over wildlife has always been intelligence, and now I didn't even have that. I returned to the problem of where to go next. Assuming I entered through the single door, I focused my attention on the remaining two, another left or right choice. I could have played the what-if game all day had I not been interrupted by the activity occurring outside of the maze. My attention was drawn to the giant monitors above. Every other screen alternated between me and a countdown clock with 20 seconds remaining. I wasn't sure what would happen when it reached 0, nor was I eager to learn, but I also couldn't tear my gaze away as some of the monitors changed to shots of the audience. Before, the stands were full of unsavory characters, to say the least, but now it was filled with corpses. There were tens, if not hundreds of thousands, and they were all pasty pale shades of green and gray, with missing parts and rotting flesh. My eyes happened to fall on one without a head. It sat in the bleachers with all the rest. Its arms raised and fell as if it were cheering, but everything above its neck was simply gone. There was also something wrong about the night around us. It wasn't a normal kind of darkness. It felt like nothing. Like the outside world was gone, and we were the last life forms left in all of existence. There was a certainty that if I took one step outside of the stadium, it would be colder than a world without a sun. Left or right? I absorbed these new sights in only 5 seconds as the countdown reached 15. The soft ticking rose in volume. Left or right? At 10 seconds, each progressive tick grew louder until I couldn't stand the pressure, and I bolted through the door to the left. It automatically closed behind me, and a small brown ball of mangy fluff hurled itself towards my head before I could take in the first thing about my new surroundings. Even the wondrous coca plant couldn't save me from such speed. What did save me, however, were the authentic gladiator skills that allowed me to gracefully tuck and roll out of the way. My previous contract was still in effect. I hadn't noticed it before, presumably because the battle had already ended, but it was impossible to mistake now. I suddenly knew how to hold the sword and shield properly. Surprise, surprise, my grips had been all wrong. My shield and armor were much heavier, and my sword was razor sharp. I also knew how to stand and move based on my enemy's body language. Not that the latter helped a ton against a rabid rabbit, but I knew it nonetheless. I turned as the demonic little furball flew past. The moment it touched the ground, it launched itself back at me, but I was ready for it. There was a dull yet satisfying clunk as I batted it away with my shield, and it hit a nearby tree. Only then did I realize I was standing in a gloomy, overgrown forest. With a quick glance over my shoulder, I saw the buzzard just 6 feet behind me, but the rabbit was already shaking off the effects of its collision and preparing for the next attack. I took 2 steps back to shorten the distance and crouched low, bracing for the next assault. The impact sent waves of painful vibrations through my arm, but I deflected the animal up and over my shoulder, allowing me to turn and hit the buzzer. Finally, the little bunny was still, and I had my first good look at it. Its eyes were red and intelligent. It glared at me with an undeniable resentment, and white foam dripped from its mouth just as it had with the rat. Now, confident it would no longer attack, I took a few steps closer to see tiny needle-like claws protruding from its little feet. The rabies worried me the most. Under normal circumstances, a rabbit scratch would hardly be noticeable, but now it could be deadly. I glanced at the monitors above, but the countdown clock hadn't started yet. Most of the screens showed instant replays of my fight with the rabbit, or shots of the cheering audience. But I didn't expect those to last long. The wall across from me had one door in its center, so I expected the wall behind me to have two, but it also featured a single door placed in the middle, as did the other two walls. I had to choose between 4 doors and had no clue which one I had entered from. If I chose the rat room, would I have to face it again? My heart was threatening to burst again. Taking several deep breaths, I turned to the wall that I was originally facing and tried to replay my steps since the first attack. With my back to what I hoped was my starting point, I walked straight across and turned the knob, only to be electrocuted. My jaw clenched. I went completely rigid, and I was only able to release the knob when gravity wrenched my hand free with my falling body. The crowd was wild with cheers and laughter, and I swear the rabbit was smiling, while I laid there waiting for the spasms to pass and to regain my composure. When I was able to pull myself into a sitting position, I rested with my back against the wall of the electrified door and considered the remaining 3. My best guess as to why the door would be electrified was that it must be the one that I'd entered from. It made sense that I wouldn't be allowed to backtrack, or what would stop people from going in an infinite circle. Without knowing the maze's shape or order of the animals, going in a straight line was the only strategy that seemed to make sense. Surely that had to be the key to only facing 5 opponents. But then, I worried that Mags was counting on people to utilize that strategy, so they could place the most difficult enemies in their path. I would certainly rather face a larger number of small animals to avoid the dragon or ox. Again, I became lost in the endless sea of what-ifs until the countdown clock began ticking loudly and forced me back into reality. 15, 14, 13. I leapt back onto my feet and sprinted to the opposite door, stopping just before my hand touched the knob. 10, 9, 8. Then, with one more steady breath, I threw myself into the next room. I was now in a junkyard. Trash was strewn about in great piles, with various appliances lining the walls. Again, I was both inside and outside, which can be strangely disorienting. Even the smell was authentic. Choking back the urge to gag, I scanned the area for my opponent, and this time, I heard it before I saw it. A low, throaty growl sounded to my right, and in the same instant, I turned to be knocked down by a heavy black mass that pinned me to the ground. I was barely able to get my shield between our bodies before the impact, and it was now the only thing preventing a more than 200-pound dog from tearing out my throat. It looked like a mix between a Rottweiler and a Great Dane. That's how massive it was. White foam from its mouth dripped onto my chin, while my arm felt like it was going to snap under the enormous weight. There was only one option available to me. It was more of a reflex than a conscious decision, but my grip tightened around the handle of my sword, and I plunged it into the beast's side. Its scream was nothing like the cry of a dog, but the roar of a wounded monster. And thick, hot blood poured over my hand and down my arm. As it slumped forward, I rolled out from under its weight and removed my sword. The blood covering, well, everything, was black as tar and had the same consistency. It was also burning my skin. I looked for anything to wipe it off and discovered a small pile of dirty rags amongst the garbage. Knowing the countdown clock could start any moment, I set my sword and shield aside to work faster I'm not sure if the red, itchy rash that spread across my arm was from the blood or whatever was on that disgusting rag, but as I lifted my sword from the ground, I heard movement behind me, and I turned just in time to dive away from the lunging dog. It had healed, because I forgot to hit the buzzer. It was such a stupid mistake. I didn't even have time to pick up my shield. It didn't mindlessly continue to charge as the others had. It made sure it put itself between me and the buzzer, and slowly backed me towards the corner. I probably could have gotten it with my sword if I'd let it latch onto my arm, but how would I finish the game if my left arm was crushed? I stopped retreating and swung my blade in a low, sweeping strike, but the beast flattened its belly to the ground and lunged at my ankle, the same one that I had sprained while running from Mags. Then, with a quick yank, I was lying flat on my back. My tall leather boots had stopped the fangs from piercing my skin, but my bone was being crushed, and the pain was out of this world, even with my special medicine. The sound of my agonized scream was completely drowned out by the roar of the cheering crowd. They were going wild while I struggled to see through the black spots dotting my vision. The gladiator skill saved me once again as I brought down my free heel atop its nose. An extra shock of pain shot through me as well, but I didn't let it slow me down. I pulled myself to an upright position and pointed my sword at the dog just as it lunged for another attack. Had I been even a half a second slower, it would have been my throat torn open instead of his. Refusing to make the same mistake twice, I leapt to my feet, arm already reaching for the buzzer, and then I slammed into the ground because my ankle gave out. Didn't matter. The buzzer was getting pressed. The end. I crawled to that bitch, used the pillar to pull myself up, and I slapped the big red button. Then I collapsed back onto the ground as the annoyingly cheerful tune played again. It was adding insult to injury is what it was doing. Don't think for a second that it wasn't chosen deliberately. I looked around to see that I was once again faced with choosing between 4 identical doors, and I was about 90% certain that I knew which one I'd entered. What I faced next might have been a matter of pure luck, but at the very least, I didn't want to get shocked again. Then I wondered, would I have been shocked in the real world as well? Or would I just simply have faced a locked door? Obviously, I didn't want my soul to be electrocuted, but if it was going to happen anyway, I'd rather not feel it. The shift worked the same as it did before. All I had to do was think about it, and suddenly I was back. The dog was actually just a big man with a weighted chain, which made me think of my ankle. The pain was a mere fraction compared to what it had been before. I also hadn't realized how stale the air on the other side was until returning, but the difference was unmistakable. Unfortunately, the downside was that I lost my bearings. It seems that my sense of directional awareness was also largely influenced by my gladiator skills. Now that it was gone, I just couldn't be sure where I entered. Not wanting to waste too much time, I made the best guess at which door to go through next. But the knob wouldn't turn beneath my hand. It was locked, and likely electrocuting my soul on the other side. Still, assuming this meant it led to the previous room, I moved to the opposite door and felt the knob turn easily beneath my hand. But I stopped short of opening it. I didn't want to face my next opponent until shifting back, and with that simple thought, there I was. The pain in my ankle returned to agonizing levels, and the countdown began. The moment I cracked the door open, I was hit with an intense heat wave and instantly realized my mistake. It was the dragon's den. I was inside a massive cave filled with treasure. A wall of fire appeared before me, cutting off my retreat as I tried to duck behind a large boulder. Changing direction, I only just made it past the second blast and into a crevice between 2 other boulders. The flames shot behind me, singeing the hair from my exposed skin but otherwise leaving me unharmed. There was just enough of a gap at the top of my nook to see directly above me, and the long blue dragon was hovering directly overhead, waiting for my reappearance. Its scales glimmered even in the darkness, and its tiny T-Rex arms would have been precious in any other setting, but I couldn't think of it in that way. No matter how breathtakingly majestic it was to see an actual dragon in real life, it was still trying to kill me. But there was a strange sound mixed in with the powerful flapping of its giant wings. It was the metallic clanking of a chain. One end was attached to the creature's leg, while the other was anchored to the center pillar. It seemed even demons aren't capable of controlling a dragon. Which, now that I've seen one up close and personal, doesn't surprise me one bit. I was effectively trapped in my crevice as fire rained down all around me. I thought of all the movies where someone jumped through a wall of flames and how completely impossible it was in reality. The closest flame was just a few feet away from my hiding spot, and it was already too much to bear. The idea of getting closer, let alone jumping through it, there was just no way. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay in my hole forever, mostly because it ceased to exist when one of my boulders exploded into rubble after a direct hit. With nothing left to shield me from the dragon's rampage, I scrambled to my feet and leapt out of the way, just as another burst of flames engulfed my former shelter. Thankfully, this was also about the time I realized the dragon was pausing after every second attack. It was only for a few seconds, but it felt like a cool-down period, as if it needed to recharge or gather more, whatever it is that turns their spit into a Molotov cocktail. Every move was pure instinct, but I used the trail of new rubble to make my way closer to the buzzer. So much sweat was pouring into my eyes that I constantly had to wipe it away, and my ankle still screamed, even through the extra adrenaline. A strong will to survive was literally the only thing allowing me to remain upright. When I made it to the last piece of debris, I was roughly 4 feet away from the buzzer and just waiting for the dragon's next break. But then I noticed the way its giant chain was attached to the center pillar. Someone had wrapped it around the base 3 or 4 times and simply stuck a metal pin through it. That was it. Sure, it seemed to be one of those big railroad ties, but, this was a vicious dragon. How was there no lock? That made me wonder, what would happen if it got free? None of the other animals had been chained, so clearly this one needed to be, for a reason. The bit of boulder that I was currently using to cover had broken away into small pieces, barely larger than my body. I wouldn't make it through another round of the attack, so there was no time to consider all the pros and cons. My chances had been slim to none before the dog tried to amputate my foot, but the rest of my limbs felt like jello. I truly didn't expect to live much longer, and if I was going to die, I wanted to wreck that stupid maze and hopefully take Mags with me. Everyone else, the audience and staff, were already dead anyway. When the timing was right, I launched myself at the bottom of the pillar, ignoring the buzzer completely, lest it prevent the dragon from escaping once the chain was loose. I didn't know how it prevented the other animals from moving, but they hadn't taken a single step after it was pressed, so I had to assume some kind of magic was involved. Once my hands were on the chain, I realized a bolt was screwed onto the end of the pin to prevent it from falling out. I had to unscrew it. Despite the setup being relatively new, the chain was old, as if the creature had been pinned there for years and the maze built around it. At first, I didn't think that I would be able to loosen it, but chipping away the biggest chunks of rust made all the difference. Unfortunately, I wasn't fast enough. Out of time, I was forced to dive behind the last piece of rubble near the buzzer. If I didn't end it on the dragon's next recharge, I was toast, literally. I went right back to work once the last attack blew apart my final means of defense. The exploding boulder sprayed me with shrapnel. It stuck into my exposed flesh, and it burned like a mother. But that didn't matter. A few more turns of the bolt, and the pin was ready. All I had to do was pull it out and unwind the chain. Except I was already out of time. The beast was inhaling deeply for its next attack, and I had nowhere to go. I waited until the very last second. My only hope was to dodge the fireball entirely, but even a gladiator isn't that fast. When the buzzer and its pillar were completely engulfed in flames, I received several burns. Luckily, most of them only first degree. But I also have 4 second-degree burns that I'll be dealing with for some time yet. The most important thing, however, was the beautiful sound that I heard immediately after that attack. The chain was unraveling. While I struggled to put out my flaming costume, there was nothing left to protect me, and I knew the next attack wouldn't miss. Only the dragon had also noticed its loose chain, and that interested it far more than myself. It seemed to instantly understand its freedom, and the only thing it wanted to do was get out of that room. It flew straight up out of the maze, burning everything in sight along the way. The noise was chaotic and deafening. The crowd was screaming in terror. Maybe it's possible to die twice after all. Hell, what do I know? The dragon roared as it burned everything in sight, and one by one, the giant monitors went black before falling to the ground. The last ones showed images of fleeing fans as they were consumed by a fireball. The maze walls were all burning around me, and for a moment, I feared that I would be trapped inside. But then, the world shifted again. It wasn't like the other shifts. Not only was it involuntary, but, well, how do I explain it? Imagine walking from your hallway into the bedroom. You step over the threshold and there you are. That's what it felt like when I controlled the shifts. Before I learned to control them, it felt like being pushed over the threshold. But this was more like waking up from a dream. It was an instant jerk back into reality, as if the other side wasn't even real. Back in my own reality, the audience wasn't holding up much better than their dead counterparts. It appeared as if the man playing the dragon had gotten carried away with his flamethrower. There was no sign of him anywhere, and the hedge walls were all burning fast. There was only one small section not engulfed in flames, and I ran for it with every ounce of energy remaining to me. The pain in my ankle was less but still excruciating, and I was beyond exhausted. It's still just a theory, but I'm fairly certain that using my ability to remain on the other side came at a great cost to my stamina. The extra boost I was getting from the go-go powder was gone, and I had precious little time to cover a big gap. When I finally got close, my instincts screamed for me to stop, to run away from the heat, but that wasn't an option. After diving through the flaming circle of death, the hair beneath my helmet was all that I had left. I've since had to shave it. That's all I could do, but hey, it's just hair. It grows back. Souls do not. That's all I really want, just my soul. But anyway, the rest of the maze was just as deadly. I couldn't make out what the next room used to be, but I almost collided with a screaming man who was on fire. A long train of fabric followed him wherever he went, like it was chasing him. I think it was the snake costume, but there's no telling. By now, my throat was raw from all the smoke. At that moment, I would have let Mags keep my damn soul just for a drink of water. While trying to determine which way to go next, the flaming snake man ran straight through the blazing hedge wall, and a 4-foot wide section collapsed behind him. The debris left behind was short enough to leap over, not without unbearable pain to my wounded ankle, but it was far better than the alternative. When I approached the opening, my incentive to make the jump increased tenfold at the sight of the bleachers and the panicked crowd, which was still scrambling to get away from the burning maze. It was my way out. The escape was every bit as painful as expected, but the adrenaline kept me going. I made it all the way to the bleachers and tried to lose myself in the evacuating crowd, but everything just went black. 1 second I was fleeing, the next I was waking up in total darkness, tied to a chair. Pete had witnessed my escape and took it upon himself to help me. He felt that I would have only run away if he approached me directly, which was solid logic, but I still didn't appreciate it. Basically, he was sick of taking abuse from Mags. She hadn't at all been the silent partner that she promised. It was one thing to run a secret hidden maze on his own, but everything since Halloween had been a downward spiral, and now he's nothing more than a scared little boy. Since I want my soul back, and he wants his freedom, it seemed like a great deal, if it was genuine. But how am I supposed to know if he's telling the truth? I'll give him one thing. If it is a trap, he's a damn good actor. Though, I suppose he established that when he hired me. I sometimes forget how completely he had me fooled in the beginning. But he also made some valid points. If he wanted to kill me, why not just take me to Mags right then and there? Why take me all the way to some storage facility in the middle of some random dark highway if he was just gonna let me go after we spoke? Or he could have killed me himself. I didn't want to make any rash decisions while I was burnt and bleeding. I only wanted a hospital. In the end, I agreed to contact him with a new time and place to meet after I had had some time to recover. I'm not sure if I really will or not, but it got me out of the situation faster. I guess that's another reason I'm writing this, not just to spread the word that more people will think is fiction, but to help myself see things more clearly. I'll be on crutches for a few weeks, so I definitely won't be making any moves before then. I want to prevent Mags from collecting more souls almost as badly as I want my own soul back. But I won't accomplish either of those things if I don't let myself heal. Now that all that adrenaline is gone, the burns are actually far more painful than my leg. And I know it sounds vain, but I'm not eager to go out while I look like part of the Coneheads cast. Sometimes it feels like the smartest thing I could do would be to change my name and disappear. Forget all about Mags, Pete, and the maze, and live what life I have left to the fullest. Unfortunately, I'm not that kind of girl, so, like it or not, I'm in this for the long haul. Pete did urge me to contact him sooner rather than later. The Valentine's maze is already under construction, and it's supposed to be the worst one yet. The underground setup was wildly successful. So nothing short of pure force will stop Mags now. She didn't get as many limbo souls as she would have liked, but she made a killing off the new humans. No pun intended. So, yeah, I guess that's it for this round. We finally reached the end. For now, anyway. Hello, my friends, and thank you so much for listening to today's story. I hope you enjoyed Soul Stalker Chapter 2, The Underground. This one, as well as the first chapter, were written by Paige Turner exclusively for the Darkest Hour. Can't thank her enough for her amazing work. I hope you guys will all check out her channel, linked in the description, subscribe. She's got tons of recordings of all of her stories over there, so check it out. All right, thanks again everyone for listening, and stay spooky.